That morning, the cramped courtroom of Cedar Hollow was filled to the rafters. Sunlight cut through the tall windows, falling across worn floorboards and catching the face of Miriam Carter, a young black widow barely past her 20s. Her mourning veil still covered her hair, her eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. She stood straight among the crowded benches, where townsfolk pressed shoulder to shoulder, eager to witness the fate of a black widow in a West that had little mercy. Judge Whitmore sat heavy behind his desk, his belly straining against his vest. His voice rasped through the room, carrying disdain without disguise. The Carter land cannot be held by a widow. The town law is clear. A ranch must have a male head. Without one, the property will be seized and sold at auction to settle debts. Miriam's grip tightened on the edge of her veil. Her spine locked upright. Though she knew any word of protest could draw cruel laughter, a flicker of defiance burned in her gaze. That land, built with the sweat of her and her late husband, Thomas, was being stripped from her on the weight of prejudice. The judge paused, then slammed his gavel once. There is one remedy. Elijah Kane, once a hand on the Carter ranch, has agreed to step forward. If Miriam Carter consents to marry him, the land will remain intact. A ripple of murmurs swept the room. The name cut through Miriam like a stone in the throat. Elijah Kane. The brooding cowboy whispered to have blood on his hands. He sat at the back row, tall frame wrapped in a worn leather coat, hat brim casting half his face in shadow. He gave nothing away but the steady ash-gray stare pinned on her, calm to the point of dread. Miriam shot to her feet, her voice trembling with anger. I don't need another to claim my land. It is mine, and my husband's. He has no right. Order! The judge barked, gavel cracking against wood. Your choice, Mrs. Carter, a lawful marriage to keep the ranch, or surrender it to the authorities within the week. Laughter hissed from the benches. A black widow thinks she can keep a ranch? Someone sneered. Each word stabbed at her chest. Her eyes found Elijah again. He hadn't moved, his rough hands resting on his knees. Only his gaze spoke, a gaze that burned the distance between them, hard as steel, shadowed by darkness she couldn't read. Miriam shivered. In those eyes was both iron resolve and something deeper, quieter. The silence thickened. Miriam drew a breath, swallowing the stone lodged in her throat. To let go of the ranch meant surrendering every memory of Thomas. To accept this marriage meant chaining her life once more. Her heart screamed against it, but reason whispered there was no other path. Yes. Her voice was hoarse but steady. I consent. The gavel struck again, sealing her fate. The crowd broke into smirks and whispers. Some chuckled, others slapped shoulders as if victory had been won. Miriam stood, rigid, her hands trembling beneath her dark dress. Elijah rose. He walked from the back with slow, heavy steps, boots echoing across the floor. The townsfolk parted as though pressed by an unseen force, silence falling sharp as a blade. When he stopped beside her, only half an arm's length away, the air seemed to thicken. Miriam lifted her chin. Her eyes still burned with fury, yet in their depths lingered helplessness. Elijah inclined his head in the faintest nod, as though speaking a vow without words. Small as the gesture was, her heart jolted. The judge's decree rang out. From this day, Miriam Carter and Elijah Kane are lawfully wed. The Carter Ranch shall remain under the Kane family. Miriam felt the invisible rope tighten around her neck. She turned away from the stares that cut and mocked. Yet Elijah's gaze still pressed on her, not of triumph, not of pity, but of a man set to walk the same road as hers, no matter how hard. Outside, the wind drove red dust across the square. Laughter and hoofbeats scattered into the distance, leaving Miriam at the side of the man now called her husband. No flowers, no rings, no blessings, only humiliation and silence. So began their forced marriage, beneath the scorn of the town and with two hearts still heavy with wounds. Their house, once so familiar, felt foreign the moment Miriam moved in with Elijah. The old kitchen, the wall where Thomas's faded photograph still hung, the oak table that had carried so much laughter, all of it seemed wrapped in a silence heavy enough to choke. That first evening, by the faint light of an oil lamp, Miriam laid down her line. She sat across from Elijah, her hands clasped tight in her lap, her gaze unwavering. "This marriage exists only on paper," she said, her voice hard. "I need nothing else. You have your room, I have mine. That is all. Do not cross that line." Elijah didn't argue. He didn't even flinch. He simply gave a small nod, his eyes steady and cold as a winter lake. "All right," he answered, plain and short. Yet the nod carried weight. It wasn't resignation, it was deliberate acceptance. That difference unsettled her. Day followed day, and Elijah kept to his word. He slept in the spare room behind the barn, up before dawn, and out in the fields before the sun had cleared the ridge. But slowly, the ranch itself began to change. The broken fence was mended with fresh posts so solid that a hammer had to strike twice before they budged. The leaking water barrel was replaced, and each morning, a bucket of clean water waited outside the kitchen door. No one had asked him. No words had passed between them. Still, the work bore his hand. One afternoon, as Miriam led her horse to the stable, she found Elijah kneeling at the garden plot, working the old windmill back into shape. The last light of day spread amber across his broad back, tangled hair faded from the sun. Miriam halted, caught off guard by a strange stirring inside her, uneasy, unfamiliar, as though some unseen cord was tugging her toward him despite herself. But Cedar Hollow was never one to pass on a chance at cruelty. Every trip Miriam made to the market brought stares that burned hotter than the noon sun. White women whispered behind her. "A black widow marrying a blood-soaked cowboy dares to hold her head high." Men at the saloon smirked, their voices carrying, "He married her for the land." Who'd want a black widow? Miriam walked past, chin lifted, though each word carved fresh wounds into her chest. Elijah, however, chose otherwise. Folks said that after one day when Miriam left the market pale and tight-lipped, he walked straight into the saloon. He didn't shout, didn't swing fists. He only laid a calloused hand on each table he stopped at, his eyes like gunmetal. "Shut your mouths," he told them, slow and steady, every word falling like an anvil. From then on, the laughter dwindled. In its place lingered wariness. When word reached Miriam, her feelings tangled. Relief warmed her for not standing alone against the town. Yet unease gnawed at her. His defense might only feed the rumor that she was a woman hiding in the shadow of a dangerous man. That evening, Elijah handed her a pair of leather gloves he had taught Sun mended. She reached out to take them and brushed his hand. The touch was nothing, fleeting. Yet a spark shot through her like lightning, leaving her breathless. She snatched her hand back, heart pounding, cheeks burning beneath the oil lamp's glow. Elijah's hand stilled for half a second, his gaze locking on hers. He said nothing. In his eyes, she caught something she hadn't expected. Not possession, not pity, but a quiet knowing that shook her more than she cared to admit. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the wind moaned through the cracks and the horses stamped in the dark. She saw only the rough hand against hers, the unyielding eyes that seemed to carry more than silence. A crack had opened in the wall she'd built around her heart. Thin but real. The ranch itself remained the same. Dust gathered at the threshold. Wind pressed against the shutters. But Miriam could feel it shift beneath her feet. This house was no longer hers alone, and Elijah's presence, steady and silent, seeped into every board, every room. Strange. Uneasy. Yet carrying with it a warmth she had not expected. A strange roof had formed above them both, and under it Miriam found herself walking paths she had sworn she never would. Each glance, each unmeant touch, pushed her closer to the man she had vowed to keep at arm's length forever. Cedar Hollow's main street never truly slept. Oil lamps spilled their dull yellow glow from Bennett's saloon, mixing with hoarse laughter, the scrape of chairs against wooden floors, and the sharp clatter of a banjo. Miriam had no wish to walk near such places, but that night she needed flour, and the general store kept late hours. Her basket swung lightly from her arm as she strode with brisk steps, determined to draw no eyes. Yet as she passed the saloon doors, a long whistle pierced the night, followed by coarse laughter. "Hey there, Carter's Black Widow," a drunk slurred, staggering into the street with his beer cup sloshing. "Word is you've got yourself a new husband now. Or maybe there's still room for the rest of us." A cluster of men poured out behind him, faces flushed with liquor, eyes glinting with hunger. Their laughter drowned out the banjo's tune. Miriam tightened her grip on the basket handle, her pulse quickening as she stepped back, her spine pressing against cold brick. The circle drew in closer. "Just a bit of fun, Mrs. Carter," one sneered, reaching for her wrist. Before the hand could touch, a shadow tore through them. Elijah Kane. He seized the man by his collar and flung him down into the mud. The others faltered, then lunged like rabid dogs. Miriam could only stumble aside, her breath caught in her throat as Elijah's fists crashed through the mob. One punch sent a man sprawling. A sweep of his arm hurled another into a whiskey barrel that splintered with a crack. Groans mixed with curses, filling the street. But numbers weighed heavy. A bottle shattered, jagged glass slicing across Elijah's arm. Blood spilled dark under the lamplight. Miriam gasped, instinct driving her forward despite the jeers that still clung to the air. "Enough!" Elijah's roar shook the night. His ash-gray eyes blazed, and for a moment even the drunkards felt the line they dared not cross. Silence pressed down. Then, muttering and cursing, they slunk back into the saloon. Elijah straightened, breath ragged, blood dripping steady to the dirt. Miriam's knees quivered, but she stepped to him, grasped his wrist. Her voice broke yet held firm. "Come with me." Back in the ranch kitchen, Miriam fetched the old wooden box of bandages, needles, and thread. Elijah sat, his sleeve soaked red. He watched her every movement, quiet as stone. She cleaned the wound. When cloth touched his skin, he hissed, and she glanced up, meeting eyes that held restraint, but asked for no pity. It was she who felt bare under that gaze. "You risked too much," she whispered, her hand trembling with the needle. "Couldn't stand by and let them touch you," Elijah answered, voice low, stripped of boast. The needle pierced flesh. Stitch by stitch, she bound the wound. Her fingers brushed his arm now and again, and each time a warmth shot through her, unsettling and sharp. The kitchen thickened with silence, broken only by the snap of the cheshawas and fire and the rhythm of their breathing. Time seemed to slow. Miriam's eyes lingered too long on him. The sunburned brow, the firm jaw, the gaze that never wavered. Elijah held her stare, quiet yet burning, as though saying more than words ever could. When the final stitch was tied, Miriam realized her heart was pounding, her palms damp. She hurried to wind the bandage, hiding her flush, but as she tied the knot, Elijah's hand lifted, brushing hers. It was a fleeting touch, soft and sure, yet it told her he had felt her trembling. She jerked back, rising quickly, turning toward the fire to shield her face. He said nothing more. He only sat, letting the firelight cast their shadows long across the wall. Two figures bound in silence, tense yet strangely tender. Outside, the night wind howled across the plain, sweeping away the echoes of cruel laughter. In the small kitchen, Miriam felt, for the first time, the distance between herself and Elijah shrink, fragile but undeniable. The day carried no wind, yet the ranch air felt heavy, as if a storm lay buried beneath the soil. Miriam stood on the porch, her hands clamped tight around the rough wood rail. Far across the fields, the sunset bled red over fences Elijah had mended, over the land where Thomas once rode, and now only silence lingered. Inside, Elijah sat before the hearth, his shirt draped across the chair. Firelight played along his bandaged arm, stitches still fresh from Miriam's hand. He carved a block of wood with a small knife, but his rigid back made it clear he was a man bracing for judgment. At last he spoke, his voice hoarse, as if each word had to be pried loose from stone. I am not the kind of man this town should trust. Miriam turned, her dark eyes locking onto him. Elijah lifted his gaze, the ash in his eyes burning sharp. I was a hired gun. Whoever paid, I drew iron. My hands have been stained with the blood of men whose names I never even learned. The words dropped into the room like stones plunging into a well. Miriam froze, her heart clamped tight. Every rumor she'd ever caught in whispers at the market, every half-hidden look when his name was spoken, all of it stood laid bare. The man who by law was her husband had lived by killing. She clutched at her dress, a chill cutting through her spine. Those same hands that had fixed her fences and set buckets of water at her door, she now saw them gripping cold steel, fingers curling around a trigger. So, the talk in town, it was all true? Her voice cracked low, yet her eyes held him. Elijah didn't flinch. True. And worse besides. He laid the knife down, fists tightening until the knuckles blanched. I wanted to leave it behind. Thomas knew what I was. Before he died, he asked me to protect you. I thought this might be a way to pay back a piece of what I owe. The fire popped, its crackle filling the silence. Miriam felt the weight press against her chest, a wall rising thick inside. The truth cut deep, yet hidden in it was something she had never known. Thomas had seen it all, and it was Thomas himself who had placed her life in Elijah's hands. Her throat ached as she shook her head. You speak of protecting, but who is to protect me from your past? Elijah lowered his head, broad shoulders sagging. I don't ask your forgiveness, only that you know who I truly am. Miriam stood still, his words burrowing deep. Pain, yes. But mingled with it came a strange recognition, the sense of being shackled by a past no one else could see. A dry laugh slipped from her lips, brittle as cracking wood. The town has always said I was lucky to marry Thomas. They never knew the truth. My father traded me for land. A contract sealed my fate. I had no say. I was never a wife. Only a bargain kept Elijah's head snapped up, his eyes alight. Miriam turned away, her voice trembling yet edged with steel. I lived in this house for years, bearing false praises, enduring stares that cut. They all thought I had a perfect husband. Not one of them knew I was never once truly loved. The silence thickened, heavy as fog. Elijah studied her small frame trembling, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles shone white. An unseen scar revealed itself, not upon her flesh, but etched into her heart. Slowly, Elijah rose. His boots pressed hard against the wooden floor as he stepped closer. Miriam did not turn, only felt the warmth draw near. Then a broad hand settled on her shoulder, not pressing, not binding, only a touch, steady and still. Miriam stiffened. Heat seeped through the thin cloth, sending a shiver across her. For a moment, she wanted to yield to that strength, to lean into it, but just as quickly his hand slipped away. Elijah stepped back, voice rougher than the night wind. I shouldn't have. Miriam turned, her eyes wet yet clear with resolve. You don't need to apologize. For the first time, someone dares to tell me the truth. Their gazes locked. In the smothering air of that cabin, they saw in each other not only guilt, not only bloodied pasts or forced memories, but the same wound. Two lives bound by scars carved against their will. Outside, the sun sank, and darkness swept across Cedar Hollow. Within the small wooden house, two souls, once strangers, once bound in chains, stood nearer than ever. Not for love, not yet for trust, but because they had at last seen the true scars each carried. And from those scars, something fragile, unspoken, began to take root. Cedar Hollow lay smothered under a sweltering dusk, the sky sagging heavy with black clouds swollen for rain. Miriam stood on the porch, wind cutting through the fields, carrying the hot tang of dust and iron. Something in the air raised the hair on her arms, a sound beneath the wind, like hoofbeats rolling nearer. Soon the ranch gates rattled under iron striking wood. A line of riders in black fanned out before the fence. Weathered faces, eyes like blades. Miriam knew at once. These weren't merchants or travelers. Elijah stepped from the barn, shoulders wide, casting a long shadow against the stormed sky. His gaze fixed on the scarred man at the head. Cain, Elijah said, his voice low as distant thunder. The man sneered, showing yellowed teeth. So it's true. You traded bullets for a plow, Elijah. The best gun we had, now turned into a watchdog for a black widow? Laughter followed, rough and bitter, sharp as lightning and dry wind. Heat flushed Miriam's cheeks. Elijah's eyes didn't blink. His voice rang steady, harder than steel. I've laid that life down. I'll spill no more blood. All I want is a simple life. To be loved. To be happy. The words struck Miriam like a sudden bell. To be loved. The confession slipped bare into the gunpowder air. Cain spat into the dirt. "You're a traitor, and traitors never rest easy," he signaled with his hand. 3 men dropped from their saddles, revolvers in hand. The air thickened, charged with the hiss of grass in the wind, the drum of hooves pawing earth. Elijah turned his head slightly, voice sharp. "Miriam, inside. Bar the door." But Miriam didn't move. For the first time, she stepped to his side, her eyes blazing. "I won't run." "This is my home too." She reached for the rifle propped by the door. Thomas's old hunting piece. Her hand trembled at first, but steadied as she gripped the stock. She stood close enough that her shoulder brushed Elijah's arm, the space between them filled with breath and storm. Elijah glanced at her. Surprise flickered, then softened into a quiet pride. He gave one short nod. The clash erupted. Gunfire split the sky, thunder answering overhead. Elijah moved like a storm's gust, his pistol flashing fire, dropping one man to the dust. Miriam's heart hammered like a drum. She raised the rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. The shot cracked loud, striking the ground at the boots of a charging man. He faltered, and Elijah was there, swinging his gun stock into the man's temple, felling him. Smoke swirled, horses screamed, the field filled with chaos, and then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. 2 men scattered into the dark. Cain backed toward his horse, eyes burning like coals. "This isn't over," he growled, before spurring into the storm, his men vanishing in the black. When the dust settled, only the pounding of Miriam's heart remained. She still gripped the rifle, heavy in her arms, her breath jagged. Elijah stepped close, his rough hand covering the barrel, easing it down. The touch was firm but gentle, grounding her. Their eyes locked, holding longer than reason required. In that look, Miriam saw something she hadn't expected. Safety. Not the kind promised by laws or hollow vows, but a safety born of flesh and will, of a man scorned by the town, yet willing to bleed for her. The wind swept through, carrying the acrid scent of gun smoke, lifting strands of Miriam's hair. The rifle slipped from her hands. Her palms trembled, no longer from fear, but from the tremor of something breaking loose inside her chest. Elijah remained at her side, ash-gray eyes steady, as though holding her in an unseen embrace. The distance between them was gone. What bound them now was more than the forced marriage decree. It was the storm they had just weathered, and another storm rising quietly within. That night the storm came as though heaven itself meant to test them once more. Wind screamed across the roof, rattling the wooden beams like war drums. Rain battered the windows, spilling against the porch, seeping through the cracks so that even the stout ranch house shuddered beneath the gale. Miriam sat in the chair by the fire, a blanket clutched around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the restless flames. Yet the blaze could not drive out the chill squeezing her chest. She had lived her life under the cold of judgment, but this cold, the storm outside, the vast emptiness of the room within, pressed tighter, threatening to suffocate her. The door opened with a gust. Elijah stepped in from the porch, clothes soaked, his shoulders darkened with water. He closed the door, raking the rain from his hair. His ash-gray eyes lifted and met hers. For an instant, the storm outside faded, leaving only the quiet tension strung taut between them. "Sleeping apart tonight is a risk," Elijah said, voice low and rough. "If the roof gives, you'd be alone." Miriam pulled the blanket closer. I'm not used to sharing a room with a stranger. He stood still, firelight cutting hard across his weathered face. We fought side by side today. I'm no stranger anymore. She meant to argue, but her throat refused. Perhaps he was right. She gave a small nod, and Elijah dragged a chair closer, settling beside her. The wind howled, thunder cracked, the walls shivered, but the space between them shrank to the length of a breath. A flash of lightning lit her face, carving the worry plain. She whispered, almost a confession. I'm not afraid of the storm. I'm afraid of being left behind. All my life, men have come and gone, leaving me to fight alone. Elijah sat silent, his calloused hands tightening on his knees. When he spoke, his voice was gravel, stripped bare. I've never kept anyone. Blood on my hands made loss my companion. But tonight, for the first time, I want to hold someone close. I want to hold you. The words fell heavy, striking her heart with the same force as the rain on the roof. Miriam lifted her eyes, deep and dark, and found his gaze waiting, once veiled with shadows, now burning with intent. Elijah's hand moved, hesitant, before brushing against hers. The touch jolted her chest, a tremor racing her spine. Instead of pulling away, Miriam turned her palm, threading her fingers with his. Rain hammered harder, but in that room time seemed to stop. Elijah bent near, his breath warm against her cheek. Miriam caught the sense of him, leather, smoke, and the storm itself, fused into something she could no longer call foreign. When their lips met, Miriam knew it was not the kiss of a bargain, nor the haste of desire. It was a vow without words, drawn from the marrow. The wall they had built with silence crumbled to dust. She closed her eyes, yielding to the heart she had long caged. The storm's roar became a hymn as, though earth and sky bore witness to the tempest rising within her. Elijah pulled her against his chest, his arms locked around her, solid as a rooted tree against the wind, yet trembling with a gentleness that feared breaking what was fragile. Miriam laid her head there and heard his heartbeat, wild and uneven, echoing her own. In that moment, both knew they were no longer strangers forced beneath one roof. They had stumbled upon what they had craved in secret, a place where flight could end, a hold that promised no abandonment. That night, with rain lashing and thunder roaring, they found each other, and only to still the fear, but to admit a truth. Between grief and scorn, between bloodied past and fear of neglect, they had carved out a place to belong. Miriam was no longer just a widow alone. Elijah was no longer a man shadowed by gunsmoke. They were two broken souls fitting into each other's gaps, rewriting the meaning of family. The storm became a turning. Out of a marriage forged in coercion, a true love had taken root. And when dawn came, even if the gale had toppled houses, they would stand certain that inside them was a shelter nothing could shake. The morning after the storm broke across Cedar Hollow, the prairie lay scarred and silent. Uprooted trees sprawled across roads, porches torn away, shingles scattered like cards thrown by a giant hand. Smoke from smoldering timbers still hung in the air, sharp as rust. Miriam and Elijah rode into town to lend help. As they passed the narrow alley behind the smith's shop, Miriam caught the faint cry of a child. She turned and saw flames clawing at a wooden shack. Beside the wreckage, a small boy lay curled tight, his face streaked with ash, his wide eyes trapped with animal panic. Miriam ran without pause. She lifted the boy from the debris, heedless of the smoke clinging to her hair and dress. He coughed hard, the sound breaking into sobs. "Elijah!" she called. He swung down from his horse, wrapped the boy in his coat, and carried him clear of the fire. They stopped only once they'd reached the square, where townsfolk fought to drown the embers. The boy's name was Sam, 9, maybe 10. His parents had perished in the blaze. When the tale reached Miriam's ears, her vision blurred with tears. She knelt, brushing soot from his tangled hair, her hand trembling. In his eyes she saw a fear she recognized too well, the terror of losing everything, of standing small against a world that had turned cold. "He has nowhere left," she whispered. Elijah met her gaze, gray eyes unreadable but deep. He knew her mind before she spoke it. A long pause, then a slow, firm nod. "We'll take him home." From that day forward, the Carter Ranch no longer housed only two. Sam slept in the spare room, and each morning Miriam set a warm bowl of porridge before him. At first, he spoke little, gaze darting away whenever eyes met. But in time, laughter rose from the kitchen, breaking the long silence that had haunted its walls. One afternoon, Miriam sat on the porch, needle and thread moving across Sam's torn shirt. The waning sun spread across her gentle face. Sam crouched below, cradling a stray cat he had claimed, chattering about how it chased mice. Miriam smiled softly, warmth blooming in her chest, a warmth she had not felt since Thomas's death. Out in the yard, Elijah led a bay horse by the reins. He called, voice steady but kind. "Come here, boy." Time you learned to ride, Sam's eyes lit bright. He dropped the cat and ran. Elijah lifted him high, settling him in the saddle, his large hands guiding the reins. "Sit tall. Don't be afraid. A horse will feel it." Sam nodded, small hands gripping leather. Elijah walked close, his rough palm covering Sam's, guiding each move. From the porch, Miriam watched. Her heart stirred at the sight. The boy no longer trembling as he had in the fire's shadow, and Elijah, once branded a killer, now standing like a father. When Sam burst out laughing as the horse trotted slow around the yard, Miriam blinked against the blur in her eyes. That sound, man, boy, and shared joy, touched the sa'tsung, deepest wound inside her, where loneliness had long lain buried. That night, after Sam had fallen into sleep, Miriam tucked the quilt around him. She lingered at his bedside, watching the peace on his small face. Behind her, Elijah stepped close. He said nothing, only laid a hand on her shoulder. In that touch, Miriam felt what she had never known, the pulse of a home with a soul. Days passed, filled now with Sam's laughter. Miriam cooked more. Elijah spent hours teaching the boy to tend horses, to strike a fire, to sit steady in a saddle. Slowly, a rhythm took hold, the rhythm of a household, of family. One morning, sunlight spilled through the windows. Sam came shyly to Miriam with a handful of wildflowers. "For you, Mama," he mumbled. The word struck her still. She had never once been called that. Her heart broke open, full. Elijah stood across the yard, silent, watching. And though his face gave little away, for the first time Miriam saw the curve of a smile. She realized then that the scars she carried were healing. Elijah's were too. And it was Sam, the orphan they had pulled from the ashes, who had bound them together into something whole. On this harsh land where wind still tore through each season, there now stood a home, a kitchen filled with laughter, a man's hands raising fences, a woman's hands mending clothes, and a child's voice calling them both to the table. They were no longer two strangers forced to share a roof. They were a family. Rumor always ran faster than any horse. Only days after the fire, Cedar Hollow was alive with whispers, sharp as thorns. Folks said Miriam Carter, the Black Widow, had no shame. She'd taken an orphan into her house, and worse, she lived under the same roof as a man once known as a hired gun. "That house is a den for sinners now," one fabric seller muttered to her neighbor. "Colored or not, they're all the same," another chimed in, drawing mean laughter. Miriam heard it all as she stepped into the market that morning. In the past, words like that would have bent her head low, lips bitten until they bled, as she hurried through her errands. But not today. Today her head was high, her basket steady in her grip, her dark eyes lit with steel. She chose her vegetables, laid down her coins, and said nothing. When a group of women blocked her way, clicking their tongues in scorn, Miriam stopped. She looked at them, looked straight, unflinching. It was not the gaze of pleading, nor of resignation, but the kind that forced silence, like a mirror none of them wanted to face. The noise of the morning market dulled. Whispers faltered, as though even the cruelest tongues were unsettled by the change in her. Then Elijah walked in. He came tall through the crowd, sleeves rolled, road dust still clinging to his shoulders. At once the murmurs swelled again, this time laced with dread. Elijah Kane, blood on his hands. Him and that widow, they fit too well. Elijah heard every word. His face betrayed nothing. He strode to Miriam, gray eyes fixed only on her. And before all who watched, he reached out, wrapping his scarred, rough hand around hers. Miriam froze at the warmth pressing into her palm. The heat of the fire seemed to pour from him, shielding her. The crowd's eyes bore down, burning, but for once she felt no shame, no fear. The strength radiating from Elijah was not in fists or gunfire. It was in this simple, open act. A public claim, a vow without words. She is my wife. Touch her, and you touch me. Gasps circled. Some women stared wide. Others flushed crimson with spite. But Elijah stood steady, unmoved. He said nothing, just held Miriam's hand until she answered with the faintest squeeze. When she lifted her eyes to him, there was a tremor there. This was the first time she allowed him to shield her without retreat. The first time she let his strength stand as hers. It was more than a gesture. It was a shift inside her chest. They left the market side by side. Sam skipped behind, arms cradling a bundle of kindling, his voice chattering like a bird. Elijah never released Miriam's hand, not until their boots turned onto the road home. On that walk back, Miriam felt every callus of his palm, every scar. Those hands had held death before, yes. They had drawn blood, but now they held hers, not to bind her, not to claim her, but to walk with her. Cedar Hollow could whisper and sneer. It could spit its venom all it Giton, pleased. But Miriam knew in that moment that the weight of their contempt no longer pressed the same, for she was no longer standing alone. Sunday morning bells rang clear across the prairie, their echoes carrying over ranch and field alike. Miriam smoothed the folds of her plain, dark dress and guided Sam by the hand through the front doors of Cedar Hollow's church. Elijah walked beside them, broad frame drawing stairs before they even reached the last pew. They sat in the back, eyes turned, heavy with suspicion, contempt, even fear. The choir's hymns rose, but their voices could not soften the weight of those stairs. Miriam had long grown accustomed to it. Sam, however, ducked his head, shrinking close against her side. Elijah sat upright, carved from stone. Yet in the gray of his eyes, Miriam caught something more than endurance, a resolve unlike any he'd shown before. When the pastor closed the book and the congregation prepared to scatter, Elijah stood. The scrape of wood against stone echoed through the hushed room. He stepped into the aisle, boots striking deliberate against the floor, each step like a march through his own past. Miriam's breath caught. An old woman sniffed, whispering, "Let's hear what the killer's got to say." Murmurs rippled, rising like dry grass in the wind. Elijah did not turn his head. He climbed to the pulpit, laid his scarred hand upon the wood, and spoke. "My name is Elijah Kane. Many of you know it already, or think you do. I lived by the gun. I killed for coin. I spilled blood of men whose names I never learned. That is who I was, and by that measure I have no right to stand beneath this roof under God's light." The words fell heavy, ringing against silence. Not one cough, not one laugh. Faces fixed on him, waiting. Elijah drew breath and pressed on. "But if I've anything worth saying, it is truth. I will not hide from it. My sins are mine, and they'll weigh me till my last breath. But when Miriam walked into my life, something shifted. For the first time, I wanted to put the gun down. For the first time, I wanted someone to stay. For the first time, I learned what it is to love." Rain began to patter soft against the old roof, steady as a drum. It filled the pause like a second voice. Some in the pews lowered their heads. Others pressed lips thin, their judgment unsure. Elijah's voice grew steady, slow but unyielding. "The world may call me traitor, murderer, sinner. So be it. But I stand before God and all of you and declare this: I choose Miriam. I choose to guard her and Sam, even if it costs me my life. And if that choice is a sin, then let me carry it willingly." The ash in his eyes burned bright, fierce as fire fanned high. The sanctuary hushed, not even the pastor's cane tapping. Miriam's heart throbbed like it might break her chest. She rose. Step by step, she crossed the aisle, her skirts whispering against wood. At the front, she said nothing. She only placed her hand in his. His calloused palm trembled at her touch, though his jaw held firm. Their eyes locked. Miriam gave no speech, but her gaze told him all she had chosen too. Fully, freely, without shadow or shame. From the pews came a stir. A man nodded once. A woman pressed her hand to her chest with a sigh. Another head dipped. The contempt had not vanished, but in that crowded room, the first cracks appeared in its wall. Elijah gripped Miriam's hand tighter. A weight long borne alone eased at last. It was not absolution nor forgetfulness, but something near enough. A beginning, grounded in the faith of one who mattered above all. When the service ended, many eyes still lingered cold. Yet in the aisle, Sam clung to Miriam's hand, smiling bright. And for the first time, Miriam did not bow her head as she walked out into the light. In her chest rang one truth clear. Their love was no longer hidden, no longer a reluctant pact. It had become a declaration, even if it set them against the town entire. The prairie wind blew colder than usual that afternoon, sharp as though it carried a warning. Miriam was hanging fresh-washed linens when the thunder of hooves broke across the stillness. She froze, cloth clutched in her hands, eyes lifting to the ranch gate. Elijah stepped from the barn, and even from a distance he recognized the figure astride the horse. Tall and lean, long coat worn thin, hat-brim shadowing eyes he once knew too well. "Wade Garrison," Elijah muttered, his voice rough with surprise and caution. The man dismounted slow, joints stiff with age. His face was grayer now, eyes clouded with fatigue, yet a spark from years past still flickered when they met Elijah's. "I need words with you," Wade rasped, his voice cracked by sand and whiskey. Elijah glanced toward Miriam. She gave a slight nod, guiding Sam inside. Yet she lingered near the door, her heart pricked with unease. This was no idle visit of an old friend. In the kitchen, Wade sat hunched over the table, hands trembling faintly around a tin cup. Elijah stood across from him, wary, the air between them thick. "You think I came to relive the old days?" Wade said at last. "No. I came because there's truth Mrs. Carter deserves to know." At her name, Miriam stiffened. She stepped into the doorway openly now, no longer hiding her listening. Wade turned his gaze toward her, softened with something like pity. "Thomas Carter's death," Wade spoke slow, "was not all accident, nor was it all fate." The room froze. Miriam's breath stopped short, her teeth digging into her lip. Elijah's fists clenched at his sides. "Say it plain," he growled. Wade nodded, swallowing hard before he went on. "Thomas got tangled in a deal with Mayor Whitmore and his councilman. They wanted ranch land cleared to bring the railroad through. Thomas signed once, then changed his mind, demanded more coin. To silence him, they staged an ambush, and when he died, the deeds were forged. That land should have gone straight into the hands of the council, if not for the marriage forced upon you." The words fell like hammer blows. Miriam staggered against the doorframe. The image of Thomas, her husband whom the town praised, whom neighbors called upright, fractured in an instant. The truth cut deep, yet strangely freed her too, as though a chain had snapped. He wasn't only a victim?" she whispered, voice thin as thread. Wade lowered his eyes, shame written across his weathered face. "I sat in on talks. I never pulled a trigger. But silence is a sin. I came now to pay it back. The only way left to me, by telling it straight." Elijah's gray stare burned. "So now what?" "The council, Kane, all of them, they still want this land." "Aye," Wade said, his voice heavy. "Kane and his riders are pawns. The true hand is Whitmore's. And if you're not ready, this family will be crushed before the season turns." Miriam broke then. She stepped, fully into the room, tears brimming, shoulders shaking. Elijah followed, closing the door behind them. She stood with her back to him, voice ragged. "I lived years locked in loneliness, bound to Thomas. And now," her breath hitched, "now I learn he not only chained me, but sold out the very ground beneath our feet." Elijah drew close, hands half lifted before he stilled them. "Miriam," his voice was gravel and oath all at once. "Whatever Thomas did, hear me. No one will lay a hand on you or Sam while I draw breath. I swear it." She turned, tears sliding, In his eyes she found no hunger, no lie, no ambition, only a will forged hard and a promise carved in stone. Slowly, Miriam placed her hand over his, anchoring herself. "I believe you," she said, steady though her lips quivered. "Even if this whole town turns, I will still believe." Something invisible bound them in that moment. Not the chain of circumstance nor the fragile bridge of storm-born closeness, but a choice. Clear-eyed, defiant. They would stand together against corruption and blood, no matter the cost. Outside, thunder rumbled across the horizon, clouds rolling black. Wade rose from the table, his shoulders bowed. At the door he turned, leaving one last warning. "The storm is coming, Elijah." Not from the prairie, but from the council's own hall. From the window, Miriam watched his figure fade into the gloom. Elijah stepped near, his hand closing firm around hers. In that grip, Miriam felt it clear. The world might bring its storm, but inside her heart she had found the anchor she would cling to. That afternoon, the sky over Cedar Hollow sagged heavy, gray as wet wool. Everyone in town knew what was coming. Elijah Kane and Miriam Carter would face Mayor Whitmore and his men. No guns were drawn, yet the tension cut sharper than any duel. The square before the courthouse swelled with townsfolk. Men who once mocked Miriam, women who once whispered behind her back, now crowded shoulder to shoulder, eyes gleaming with hunger for spectacle. On the steps stood Whitmore, cloak draped over his wide frame, his ruddy face flushed with rage. Behind him loitered Kane and his cutthroats, hands resting on pistols like coiled threats. Elijah and Miriam stepped through the crowd, Sam clinging close, his wide eyes darting from face to face. Miriam bent low, squeezed his hand, then straightened her back. She lifted her chin high. "Carter Ranch belongs to this town," Whitmore bellowed, "not to some Negro widow and a hired killer. Leave that land now while you've got the chance." Elijah held his gaze steady, his voice deep and clear. "You don't need to force our hand. We'll walk away." A stir ran through the crowd. Miriam stepped forward, skirts brushing the stone, her face calm but her dark eyes burning. "Yes," she declared, her voice ringing so strong the square fell still. "I want no land bought with coercion and corruption. That ranch bore the Carter name, but it was never truly mine. Today I relinquish it, not out of fear, but because I choose a life built on truth and freedom, not on lies." The words cut through the square like a clean blade. Silence stretched, brittle and taut. Then, from the back, a man nodded. A young woman whispered, "She's braver than any of us." Whitmore snarled, yet the tide was shifting. The same townsfolk who once sneered at Miriam now looked at her anew, not as a widow shackled by a bargain, but as a woman bold enough to confront a crooked mayor. Elijah clasped her hand, raising his voice for all to hear. "We'll build again with these hands. We need no charity, no land stolen by thieves. We'll raise a true home, a place for our family." Kane barked a laugh, ready to step forward, but the townspeople surged, blocking his path. For the first time, Elijah and Miriam were not standing alone. Days later, on a bare patch of prairie at the edge of Cedar Hollow, hammers struck and saws rasped. Men carried beams, women brought bread and water. Those who once cast stones now offered timber. Their apologies were wordless, but their labor spoke louder than penance. Miriam stood among them, scarf slipping from her hair, eyes damp as she watched walls rise. Children carried shingles. Neighbors lifted frames into place. For the first time in years, she felt herself seen not as a burden, not as an outcast, but as one of them. Elijah worked alongside the younger men, sweat streaming down his temples, muscles straining as he hoisted the ridge beam. Sam scampered underfoot, handing nails his laughter echoing bright. An old man approached Miriam, voice gravelly. "Mrs. Carter, no, Miriam. You're the true hero of Cedar Hollow. Without you, the truth would have rotted in the dark. Don't ever call yourself only a widow again." Her throat closed tight. She could only nod, tears shining. The words settled on her like an unseen metal, cleansing years of scorn. By the time the sun dipped low, the cabin stood. The prairie glowed gold, light slanting across new-hewn walls. Elijah laid a calloused hand on the beam, his gray eyes glimmering with quiet pride. Miriam stood beside him, Sam clutching her arm, his face smudged with dirt, but radiant with joy. Neighbors gathered, some humming, others clapping hammer to wood in rhythm, laughter spilling into the wind. Miriam turned to Elijah. In his eyes, she saw certainty. This was no longer a life on borrowed ground, but the start of something whole. She set her hand on his, whispering, "We lost nothing at all." "We found everything," Elijah bent, brushing his lips against her hair. On the steps of their new cabin, they stood together. Not two castaways defying a town, but a family now embraced by it. In the glow of sunset, Miriam knew the past was closed. From ruin they had chosen love and freedom, and in that choice they built a home, framed not just in timber and nails, but in trust and courage. That spring came late, but when the warm sun finally spilled across the prairie, the small cabin on the edge of Cedar Hollow shone like a pearl amid the grass. From the wreckage of the past, a true home had taken shape, not large, not wealthy, but brimming with life. Miriam sat by the window, her hands deftly weaving yarn into a new sweater for Sam. Morning light traced her face, illuminating a gentle smile few had seen during the bleak years before. Each stitch moved steady, like the rhythm of peace she had reclaimed after so many storms. Sam darted barefoot through the yard, mud on his ankles, laughter ringing like young birds in summer. He was no longer the trembling orphan rescued from the fire. Each morning he helped Elijah feed the horses, bind hay, and sometimes climb the saddle to ride in slow circles. Now he dashed inside, cradling a chicken he had caught, babbling through his grin to show his mother. Miriam's heart swelled with a simple, deep happiness she had once thought lost forever. At the far side of the yard, Elijah sat before a broad plank of wood. The carving knife in his hand moved steadily, letters slowly taking form. His face was grave, but his eyes gleamed with quiet joy. After years of blood and shadow, the hands that once gripped a gun were now used to carve, to build, to raise a home. When Sam ran by, Elijah pulled him onto his lap, guiding the boy's small hand to tap the blade lightly against the wood. Sam squealed with pride. Elijah chuckled, a rare, genuine smile that made Miriam pause in wonder from her window. At noon, the three gathered around the wooden table. A simple stew filled the air with warmth. Sam ate quickly, chattering about wanting his own horse. Miriam laughed, ruffling his hair, telling him he must grow taller first. Elijah said nothing, but the way he looked at Sam held a tenderness beyond words, the gaze of a father. Outside, the spring breeze carried wildflower fragrance into the cabin. The wooden walls trembled softly, not with storm, but with the rhythm of life unfolding inside. By evening, Miriam hung Sam's new shirt on the line. Sam chased the little dog across the yard, his laughter so bright it startled birds into flight. Elijah wiped sweat from his brow, then lifted the carved sign onto the cabin door. The words stood bold and steady. Where love is chosen, the past is forgiven. Miriam read aloud, then stood beside him. Elijah placed his hand on her shoulder. No hesitation now, no fear his past would wound her. Miriam lifted her dark eyes to him and nodded. Sam ran to them, grasping both their hands, gazing at the sign with a radiant smile. In that moment, they were a complete picture. A man once branded a killer, a woman once trapped in a loveless bond, and a child who had lost everything, now bound as a true family. The people of Cedar Hollow slowly began to change. Passing by, they stopped to greet them. Some brought milk, others seed grain. No longer whispers of scorn, but quiet acknowledgement that this family belonged here. For the first time, Miriam did not feel she lived on the margins. At night, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Miriam stitched the last lines of a scarf while Sam dozed with his head on her lap. Across from them, Elijah sat in silence, his gaze lingering as if he could etch this vision into his very bones, the moment he once believed would never be his. Miriam glanced up, caught his eyes. No words were needed. Everything between them was clear. Theirs was no longer a marriage of compulsion, nor survival clung to by necessity. It was love, chosen, nurtured by trust and sacrifice. Elijah rose, laid a blanket over Sam, then brushed his hand gently against Miriam's shoulder. That touch was a whisper. Look how far we've come. Miriam leaned her head against him. Outside, the spring wind carried the scent of flowers and the hum of crickets. Inside, their journey of healing had reached its quiet end, from wounds of the past to a present full of hope. As this story closes, we see that Miriam, Elijah, and Sam hold not just a wooden house, but a home built of love and trust. On that small cabin door, the carved words say everything. Where love is chosen, the past is forgiven. And that message speaks to us all, that no matter the storms behind, peace can be found if hearts remain patient, courageous, and open. Dear friends, at any age, love and home remain life's most precious gifts. Many of us have walked through loss, through loneliness. But Miriam and Elijah's journey reminds us, it is never too late for a new beginning. If this story stirred memories or reflections within you, please share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to join us for more warm tales from the old Wild West. Thank you for listening, and may love and trust always stay within your own homes.